morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's Bench2Market talk on understanding quality management systems. My name is Courtney Law, and I am the Managing Director of Biolocity, and I'm excited that you all decided to join us today. Before we kick off today's talk, I just want to share a few announcements. Our next talk for this series will occur on April 14th. It'll be about licensing strategies for entrepreneurs, and the registration link is included at the bottom of this page. I'd also like to share that we do offer legal office hours as a part of Biolocity, where you can connect with or in combination with the Emory School of Law, and you can talk about all types of areas of interest, including IP, patent, and prior art searches, etc. And you can make an appointment for the legal office hours at the link indicated below. Biolocity is also a part of the BARDA Drive Regional Accelerator. This is the opportunity to connect with BARDA, which is a division of the Department of Human Health Services. They put out several areas of interest, and currently they have 5 different areas that they're interested in. Please feel free to contact our Biolocity team if you're interested in learning more about their application process, but they offer not only partnership, but funding opportunities up to about $749,000 per project. But to get to the talk, we are excited to have Brett Rogers here today to talk about quality management systems. Brett is a graduate of the Master of Biomedical Innovation and Development, or MBID program at Georgia Tech, and he has extensive experience in manufacturing with Facet Medical Technologies, and is a co-founder and board member of Tendinova Corporation, an Atlanta-based medical device startup. Before I turn it over, I just want to give a few logistics. Following this talk, we will host a Q&A with Brett. So if you have any questions that arise during the talk, please feel free to use the chat function. But now I will just go ahead and turn it over to Brett. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be able to speak to you all today. Definitely looking forward to having this talk. I really like this series. I love what Biolocity is doing as a graduate of Georgia Tech, and I've always lived in Georgia. It's great to see the community growing, and today being a small part of that is an awesome experience. So let me get our presentation up here. Hopefully everybody can see it. And we'll go from there. Are you all able to see the presentation?
Not yet, it's not on the screen.
All right, hold on. Apologize. There we go. All right, how about now?
Looks great.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry about that. It feels like every time you have a video conference, there's a new tool you get to learn how to use. That's great. All right, as we all know, the medical device industry and pharmaceuticals, biologics, we're a regulated industry. And as part of that, we have quality system regulations that are defined to us by the various regulatory bodies that we report into. The quality management system is really an organization's response to that quality system regulations that are put upon us. And it's the responsibility of each organization to establish that quality management system, follow it, and then maintain it throughout the product life cycle. In the U.S., common quality system regulations are going to be for the pharmaceutical side, 21 CFR Part 210 and 211 for medical devices, Part 820, and then also, ISO 1345 is a very common quality system regulation we deal with. But it's also important to recognize that quality system regulations vary by region. Canada is going to have its own, Korea is going to have its own. And so it's critical for an organization to understand what regulations apply to them and to make sure that we're in compliance with whatever regulatory body you're going to report into for the market that you're entering. I do like in recent decades, there's been a large push for harmonization. I would reference out to the Global Harmonization Task Force on this, but the intent is that we want the regulations across the world to not conflict with each other. That's really what harmonization means. It does not necessarily mean that if you comply with FDA regulations, then you automatically comply with Japanese regulations, for example. But harmonization has been a move, especially between ISO 1345 and CFR Part 820, to make sure that the requirements are more or less the same between those, and certainly not in conflict. Quality system regulations lay out a skeleton of how a drug or a biologic or a device shall be designed, tested, manufactured, sold, and monitored. As you see, that's the entire life cycle from development all the way through being on the market and being used. But they're not prescriptive. What that means is that this is not a one-size-fits-all type of regulation. It's up to the individual organizations to read the standards, read the regulation, and then implement a quality system to fulfill those requirements, but that is tailored to the organization, the products that they make, the size of the organization, what things that are applicable versus what aren't. So if you think about a startup that is in the process of designing a device, you're not going to be selling products. You're not going to be servicing product yet. So some of those regulations are not going to be applicable. And then on the other side, as I put here at the bottom, there's also, this should be a risk-based approach. So the higher risk, the more stringent the controls, the larger the company, the quality management system is probably going to grow with that. And then the more items that your company does as part of the design, development, manufacturing, sell of a device, the larger your quality management system is going to grow in response to that. So if you do servicing in the hospital for, let's say, a CAT scan machine, then that's something you're going to pick up. If you do in-house sterilization, that's something that you're going to pick up. Versus a company that may do external sterilization where it falls under supplier management versus the actual sterilization process. It also depends on the complexity of the device. So I threw some examples down here: a biopsy needle versus a hip implant versus an LVAD, left ventricular assist device. These are going to have different control mechanisms around them based off of the inherent risk as you go from, biopsy needle is a fairly low risk item, well characterized in the field, versus a, implantable LVAD, life sustaining, implanted into the patient for an extended period of time. You're going to have different responses to the regulation that your organization is going to pick up. The other part that I wanted to really highlight here is how expansive. When we're talking about quality system regulations, we're really talking about, the entirety of the process surrounding the medical device or the biologic or the pharmaceutical. And so I brought out here, this is a CFR Part 20, the subparts associated with that regulation. This is specific to medical devices, but you're going to see something very similar for pharmaceuticals. And you can see if you read through how many different processes are covered. Design controls, but also you have purchasing, you have identification and traceability, meaning labeling, serialization of implantables, for example, but also servicing, statistical techniques, storage and handling, and distribution, but then also activities around monitoring the performance of the device, both in manufacturing, but also in the field, between non-conformances and corrective action and preventative action. What this all really translates to is that a quality management system is very all-encompassing, within a medical device organization. It's going to touch almost every aspect, maybe outside of financials, of the organization. This is a little bit of another way of looking at that same thing. So quality management in the middle here, and then the 6 subgroups kind of coming out of that. Again, design controls, material controls, records, documentation, equipment, facilities, think about preventative maintenance, pest control, environmental conditions. If you think about like a clean room would be a great example of that. And then production and process controls, validation of the actual equipment that's used to produce the medical device or produce the pharmaceutical or biologic. So quality management system, very large, all-encompassing across medical device companies, and typically in med device companies or pharmaceutical companies, the quality group tends to be one of your largest groups because of just how many different areas they have to touch. When we are talking about the development process, design controls are one of the first things that kicks in. So within the quality system requirements, there are requirements or regulations, there are requirements for controlling the design control process. These are intended to assure that the identification of user needs are done, that we're defining the intended use of the device, and we're specifying the device or the pharmaceutical or the biologic. If I say device, just use that as shorthand for all 3. The requirements of it, that we're specifying those out. Design controls provide a structured approach for designing and developing a medical device. And the intent here is to catch and mitigate potential adverse events prior to the device or the biologic or the drug entering into the market. One of the stats that the FDA likes to throw around quite a bit, I think it's a little out of date at this point, but I think this was in the late 80s into early 90s, that 44% of voluntary medical device recalls may have been prevented by adequate design controls, meaning that had the organization, the medical device company in this case, or companies, followed proper, structured design, development, and controls, then we would have caught something before it got into the field. One of the things that I do is I teach a course within the MBID program, and one of the things that I have my students do is go on to the MOD database for the FDA, which is manufacturing adverse events. But anyway, it discusses adverse events with medical devices in the field, and I always have them do this every year. And one of the things that came back this year, that I think ventilators being kind of one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit over the past year, was a adverse event where a patient had died on a ventilator because the power switch was inadvertently hit by a person cleaning the room. So thinking about, probably the button that controls, a life-sustaining device being, accessible inadvertently is not a good design, right? You want something to cover that up. That's what we're kind of talking about here, is making sure up front we're thinking about what the device must do, how it must function, and then building that into the design. One of the most common questions that I get asked by my students, and I think there's a question from the group here today, was when do you trigger the design controls within a development process? And really the way that I've always thought about this, and doing reading, is it's really when you get through with feasibility. So as you're ramping down the research side of R&D, and you're entering into the development side of R&D, that's really when design controls are triggered. And then they'll sustain through the entire life cycle of the product from that point forward. When we think about design controls, one of the things that commonly gets put out is referred to as the waterfall. At least that's the way that I learned it. Is this idea of user needs cascading into design inputs, the design inputs influencing the design process, meaning you're designing a device or a pharmaceutical or a biologic to meet a certain set of inputs. And those lead into your design outputs. And then you have a verification and validation phase, which may loop back in, and there may be an iterative approach there. But that these verify that you have correctly gone through this waterfall, and ultimately there's a medical device that's on the back end, or pharmaceutical or biologic meets the user needs. Everything is traced all the way back. And the intent here again is to determine the device requirements, what the device or the biologic or the drug needs to do from the user need. Everything is traced all the way back through the process. And as part of this, one thing as we get into the verification and validation phase is that the testing requirements are informed by the user need through the design inputs and design outputs. So we're thinking about this up front. What does the device or biologic or drug need to do? We are boiling that down to discrete items that then influence our design process, that ultimately output into design outputs that can be tested. So we're turning it into something that's testable. Then we go to the testing. Ultimately, we hope that everything goes well. And assuming that it does, then we're on the market. But because we've gone through this structured process, the risk to the end user or patient has been diminished as much as it can be. And in certain cases that we've identified that a device or a drug or biologic is not marketable because it does not meet the user needs due to, maybe it's a technological issue, maybe it's it doesn't perform the way we expected it to perform when we get to clinical testing, but we've caught that at this stage. That's really what we're talking about. I wanted to put up a quick example that I thought was easily digestible. I pulled this straight off of a PowerPoint by the FDA, but in this particular example, there's a user need for this device to be portable. It's something that we all can kind of understand. So we're going to define that as the end user must be able to carry the device. Being that they need to carry the device, we're considering the dimensions of the device. It can't be 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. And we also have to think about the weight. A person's not going to carry around 50 pounds. So in this particular case, we identified that the device needed to be 5 pounds, plus or minus a pound, as their design input. They mentioned here just solving discrepancies, but that's, I think, a pretty moot point. But the design input at this point is, we want the device to be 5 pounds plus or minus 8 pounds. The design output side of that is a result of the design efforts. So as we've gone through designing the product, we're ultimately going to spit out a design output. In the previous case, it may be that we have the device specified out. We've designed it, and it's designed to be 4.9 pounds. So it falls within that design input that we specified earlier. But they're essential for the function of the device. Again, this is being that this is CFR Part 820. This is referring to medical devices, but again, you can apply a very similar concept to drugs and biologics as well. The design outputs are essential for the function, and the reason why this is bolded is a lot of times people can get carried away with defining design outputs and put stuff that is not essential for the device to properly function or for the success, and then you're adding complexity or designing in complexity that doesn't have any benefit to the end user, or from a purely internal standpoint, there's a finite amount of resources, both monetary but also human resources that are put towards a project. You want to put them towards focusing on what's essential to proper function. And once you've driven those to meeting those requirements as best you can, then you can start picking up wants and your wishes within a product. So the very end is with design outputs, and this is true of design inputs, is there needs to be a review and approval phase. So your group is going to define these, and then you're going to have a separate group that's going to come in, and then in our particular case at Facet, and this is pretty much industry standard, is you have an external reviewer, somebody who's not associated with the project at all, come in as a unbiased party to say, have we done this correctly before releasing these. Following release, you get into the verification and validation phase. So this is, we call it the final step in the development process. Keep in mind that you can get into verification and validation, have a potential failure or an issue, and cycle back into the design development phase. Go back to the design inputs and design process and through design outputs. That's okay. That's to be expected. And that's what we want. We want an iterative approach because ultimately we want the device or the drug or the biologic to be as successful as possible coming out the back end. So verification and validation, if you refer back to the waterfall, verification is, did I make the product correctly? So does my product match up with the design inputs and the design outputs? Whereas design validation is, did I make the correct product? So this is when we think about clinical testing. So design verification, can we make the product that we specified that we were going to make? Let's assume that the answer is yes. Then design validation is, does that product meet the user need? So it's a little bit broader, but in this one you think about clinical testing. Various portions of the testing are going to be included in your regulatory submission. So when you're thinking about 510K submission or de novo or IDE or a PMA submission, you're going to be including some of these testing. And I threw out a couple examples here: sterilization validation, clinical functional testing, process validations. But this list can be significantly longer, and it all depends on what the product is. And I wanted to put this note at the bottom because this is something that I think especially companies or startups that are just getting into this tend to miss. If you look at warning letters from the FDA, this is a very common thing that people get dinged on, even big companies, Stryker, Medtronic. You get dinged on not validating a manufacturing process. Now, I want to be a little, at the risk of muddying the water here, this validation is not the same as design validation. It's the process validation. But while I had this on a slide, I wanted to bring it up. But any manufacturing process where the outcome of it cannot be 100% verified must be validated. I want to really emphasize that. That's something that is missed quite a bit. Final thoughts here, and this is a brief overview. I definitely feel like this is the tip of the iceberg, and I look forward to a lot of questions coming out of here. But from my experience, especially as my company is looking towards doing their FDA filing here in the next couple months, is two things that jumped out at me were get in the habit of following good documentation practices very early. So if and I put two mantras here: if it's not proceduralized, it doesn't exist. So think about this as you're doing testing, even early stage testing as part of feasibility. Let's say take the 30 minutes to write a rudimentary, it doesn't have to be anything crazy formal, but write a protocol for the test that you're about to perform. I'm going to walk into this doctor's office, I'm going to hand them the device, I'm going to ask him, does this feel ergonomic? Where would you like the buttons to be moved? That type of thing. And then as an output of that, document what was found during that testing. And again, it can be done in a report. If you want to do, completely formal or informal, keep it in a notebook, but take copious notes. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So this is certainly something that, we face all the time as, regulatory groups come in and audit us. If they ask, hey, 6 months ago when you manufactured this lot of Landsets, did you check the temperature on the mold machine? If we don't have a document where, somebody signed off that said, yep, the mold machine was running within the validated range, then, if we say, oh yeah, they do that every day, that's just part of their practice. If that's not documented, then, there's no proof of it happening. So I really would emphasize, that's something that, some of the pain points that we're running through right now. And this really does help tell your story as you're preparing for your regulatory submission. Having some of those early documents prior to design controls being put in place do help fill in some gaps. The other thing that I would like to throw out is don't try to do everything yourself. Even Facet, we're an established medical device company. We don't do everything ourselves. We outsource sterilization. We'll outsource certain types of testing that would be onerous or too expensive to do in-house. This is something that's kind of to be expected, and especially as a startup, you don't have all the expertise in-house to do everything. So contracting out with a sterilization facility where they'll write the sterilization validation for you. That's something that I would recommend if you can afford to do it and it makes sense for your particular product. Take advantage of those. Also, utilize vendors and their learnings. I have learned that, a 30-minute phone call with, my sterilization contact saves me hours of, thinking about or researching a topic that I'm not particularly familiar with, but they know right off the top of their head. And consultants are great. Similar in that vein, talking to a regulatory consultant and paying them, let's say $500 to sit down with you for a couple hours to talk about your regulatory strategy, saves you, potentially weeks worth of effort. And in a lot of cases, we're better off, focusing on what's at hand, what we're actively working on than stopping and working on a regulatory strategy where somebody else who does this day in and day out can do it faster and more efficiently. So yeah, that was a very brief overview of quality management systems. It is a beast for sure, and this is it. But I will say there's a lot of great resources on the FDA website, as well as other regulatory bodies. So if you have questions, a lot of times they're out there using those resources. And I can provide a couple links, I guess, to you, Courtney, that you can distribute out to the group here that I found particularly helpful. Yeah, thank you for the time today. This was good. I hope this was insightful. And we have in the room with me, I have 4 other members of our quality and regulatory group that are going to help me facilitate the Q&A portion on the back end. So I saw a couple questions come in, I think. We can take care of. But yeah, Courtney, I'll pass it back to you for a second.
Great, thank you for this talk. And as Brett said, we are opening it up for questions now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll get them answered. So to kick it off, one of our questions, I'm aware that there are QMS systems of varying makes and models across the MedTech industry. Some of these quality management systems are built in-house and others are third party. From the perspective of a startup or small company like Facet Technologies, what are some common brand names of QMS systems currently favored by firms like yours?
Yeah, so I will say for Facet, we have our own QMS system, that we've built to match up to what we do here. For my company, Tendinova, we purchased a pre-built QMS system for startups. I don't have the name readily offhand, but there's certainly opportunities to do that, where instead of spending thousands of hours writing hundreds of pages of documents, you can buy something that's pre-built for, fairly cheap. I want to say for us it was, maybe $4 or $5 grand to get it. You still have to go through the process of implementing that and tweaking it to your system, but it's definitely a jumping off point that saves you quite a bit of time. I don't know, maybe we can answer that in terms of eQMS systems for electronic QMS systems. If you have any suggestions there.
I'd say on most of your eQMS systems, you've got to scale it towards the size of the company and resources available. Generally, a lot of startups do just build their own. That will usually hire a quality person to help document. Facet relied mostly on documentation. All of ours is hard copy documents for records and such. We are looking at transitioning out of that. There is a low cost to that, but there also is a high cost of resources as those documents start to accumulate over the years. We are paying probably roughly between $4,000 and $5,000 a month for document storage off-site. So those are things you need to consider when you're looking at the QMS system. The cost avoidances you could have from your documentation.
Great, thank you. We've had a few more questions. Is QMS a single person's responsibility or a shared responsibility?
It depends. If they got something wrong, it seems to be one person.
Yeah, I mean, generally, so this is Howard Baker. It's sitting over here, our VP of Quality. So to put that in perspective, if there was a quality concern, let's say that we performed a clinical trial and then we decided that we want to falsify a whole bunch of data that ended up getting us in trouble, the person that's going to go to jail is going to be Howard. So in that sense, Howard is responsible for it. In the reality, no. I mean, QMS is the responsibility of the entire organization. And actually, if you look within CFR Part 820, it makes it very clear that management, all the way up to the CEO, has responsibility for making sure that quality is being instituted within the company at all levels. So it is a joint effort to instill quality within an organization. But, as with anything, there is ultimately a person responsible, but we all have our part to play in that.
Great, so I'm just checking the chat as well. We did have some questions submitted prior to the talk that I think you've addressed in some detail, but do you have any other information you talk about, like how FDA inspects QMS?
Yeah, that's probably more for you guys. How does an FDA audit look and feel?
Right. I'll let James answer it. James is head of our regulatory department, director of regulatory. He deals with our third-party audits, and there has been some changes recently that are easier. I'll let James talk about it.
Right. FDA typically has used what they call the QSIT method for inspections, in which they focus on 5 areas, and there are 2 areas. One is management responsibility and CAPA that are always audited, and then the auditor will pick from the other 3 areas another area to audit. Now, on an initial audit, you're likely to be audited thoroughly on all of the areas, especially if you were in production. What Howard was referring to is if you are intending on marketing outside of the United States, especially in Canada where it is a requirement, there is a program called a Medical Device Single Audit Program, where that is not performed by FDA, but performed by a third party that you pay for. But it has the advantages of getting you market entry into multiple countries. I will also add that if you are manufacturing a or proposing to manufacture a PMA product, FDA will audit you in what's called a pre-PMA inspection.
Oh, great, thank you. Haven't seen any additional questions come through the Q&A.
I think there was a question about how to validate a clean room that was submitted prior. Anybody, I mean, my answer is probably not going to be what we want. So, anybody want to take that specifically? I mean, I'm going to say you don't. You get the contractor to validate it, but.
All right. A clean room has 4 qualification phases for validation. You start with what you call a design qualification, and that has to be geared toward the type of product you want to make in that clean room, the equipment that's going in there, and the personnel, the number of personnel that you want staffed in there. And part of that DQ phase, you define the clothing, the environment, and the monitoring system based on what you want to be doing. At the highest end, you have endpoint sterile filtration products, such as ophthalmics. And of course, that has to be very carefully designed. At the lower end, you have a what you call ISO Class 8 that has less design restrictions. At that point, you go into installation qualification, where you verify that the equipment is properly installed and that it is working as intended. Operational qualification, you look at the extremes. Maximum workforce, equipment operating, maintenance activities going on, that type of thing. You're stressing the system to make sure they're still meeting the classification requirements of the clean room. And finally, performance qualification, where you're looking at a number of days of active service and still meeting the requirements for the classification. I hope that very top-level overview answers that question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, one of the other things to consider about clean rooms is it's not just the initial validation. You're going to be monitoring that clean room, in perpetuity. Essentially, as long as it's in operation, especially if it's above a Class 8, a Class 7 and below, you're going to be doing, bioburden testing potentially. You're certainly going to be recertifying periodically. So clean rooms have a pretty high burden. And I mean, it was a little tongue-in-cheek response from me in the beginning, but I mean, as you can see, as Mitch listed off all the various things that you have to do, typically within a small company like Facet or startup, you don't have a clean room expert. So a lot of times that's why I say that lean on your vendors. The companies that install clean rooms, they already have pre-built protocols in place where they know what to do. You're gonna pay them to use them and for them to do the write-ups and perform the testing, but you're gonna know it's done right, and you're not hiring an internal person or trying to learn that on your own. So that's why I said generally I would just have the contractor do the validation, the initial validation. You still have to learn how to maintain it on your own.
Yeah, no, those are great points to consider. We do have another question. It looks like it's directed at Brett from a student's perspective. Other than your MBID class, what are some good ways that students currently in their academic training can learn more about detailed nuts and bolts for quality and regulatory best practices?
It's a good question. I mean, I would start out by saying, again, the FDA website has a bunch of resources on it. They have, video webinars that have been done. They have copious presentations. There are guidance documents. So, I mean, if you can Google FDA and,
well, particularly CDRH Learn.
Yep.
is a great resource. It goes from everything from, you know, basic introductory to very detailed, probably not what you need to know from a student standpoint, but more from an actual user standpoint. But it has a great deal of good material up there. There are also some fairly detailed guidance documents on the IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum website, imdrf.org, that has some excellent guidance there.
Go become an intern.
Sure.
It's probably one of the best.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly no substitution for doing it and living it.
Great, thanks. That was very helpful. Another question that was brought up before the talk was how early and how abruptly do you consider a transition from doing R&D work to GMP work?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna trigger, you know, I'm gonna use, instead of saying GMP.
There's no difference.
No, it's, you know, during ideation, I guess, you know, during the research phase of R&D, it's looser. But as soon as you get any type of development, you know, starting to think about this is what the device is going to look like, or start defining input.
User requirements. Once you start defining user requirements, you have started design control, and that is under regulation.
Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So you're documenting it.
Generally, if you're in a startup, you probably are already too late by the time you do it. You know, just as general rule of thumb, if you're thinking about should I be triggering design controls now, you probably already should have done it. And that's commonplace, I would say.
Yeah, most startup companies are behind the power curve when they start because they've got an idea, they've got a product they want to do.
Yeah.
They have to go back and start a lot of documentation.
Yeah, and that's why I really emphasized that, you know, one of the things for us was, you know, we had notes for testing that we did. We didn't formally document the testing, but, you know, we had, you know, in OneNote or Evernote, or we had videos or pictures that we could reference back to. And that helps if you ever get behind the 8 ball and you need to catch up, you can do that. But yeah, generally, as soon as you're starting to think about user needs and user or design inputs, you're there. Abruptly is kind of an odd question.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how complex the device is, because I guess you could do it by subsystem, and maybe one subsystem is in design controls, whereas another one hasn't quite gotten there yet.
But if it's a startup, I'm just thinking they're coming from scratch.
Yeah.
One of the biggest questions that's always asked about a quality management system, what do I do first?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the first thing to do? If you think about it, there's really, of all the clauses, there's one you got to start with. And you're going to give directions, you want to record directions, you want to have records, and without a doc control system, nothing exists. Because it's back to the old saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So generally, that's the first one you start with. And once you start with that, then you can start thinking about your design controls and all those activities, because you have a way to document it and have it become a record.
No, that's a great advice. It sounds like once you start working, you should be considering your, you know, your GMP controls and et cetera, at the very beginning.
Yep.